Hello there and welcome to the Card Grotto. Today I've got two tags to share with you using cardstock strips. This was a video that I created for the Altenew YouTube channel back in April, so I apologise if you have already seen it, but if you haven't, I hope you enjoy watching. So I'm taking some various colours of Altenew gradient cardstock sets. So I'm using the Pinkalicious from the Cherry Blossom set, Mountain Mist and Volcano Lake from Seashore, Warm Sunshine and Caramel Toffee from Summer Afternoon, and Purple Wine from the Rose Petal set. I've cut them into various widths of strips and I'm going to place them down onto a panel of cardstock. Instead of worrying about adding loads of adhesive onto the cardstock piece, I'm just adding a piece of double-sided adhesive sheet onto it. If you didn't have double-sided adhesive sheet for things like this, adding cardstock strips to it, you can definitely just use double-sided tape, or you could just cover the whole thing with tape runner. I've done that before as well, or you could just use liquid glue or something like that. But I do really like these double-sided sheets from Altenew, and they die cut really nicely because although they're fairly kind of stable, they're not sort of flimsy, they are thin enough that they die cut really nicely. So I'm now taking my cardstock strips and I'm starting off in the middle of the panel. I just find that easier for some reason, and I'm going in an order of colours that I found quite pleasing to my eye. So I'm starting off with the lightest shade of pink, then going to the darkest shade of pink, the darkest shade of kind of yellow. It looks a bit more like orange when I place it down, and then going to the yellow and then the two aqua tones. I'm doing them at a diagonal so that if they're not lined up correctly, you're not really going to see it that much. I think if they were straight and they weren't perfectly straight, your eye would really notice it, whereas if they're at a diagonal, you don't really notice it so much. So I'm just kind of placing those down in the colour order, and then I can finish up with this one here at the top. And then I'm just going to cut off the excess from the back. I didn't really need to for the purposes of what I'm doing, but it is quite helpful just to be able to see where that white panel is underneath. I then want to cut it down into a tag, so I'm taking the Altenew Terrific tag dies and I'm just going to place one of those on the panel, hold it down with some low tack tape, and then I can run that through my die cutting machine. So now I've got that tag completely covered with all of the cardstock strips. But for the next tag, I wanted to leave a little bit of white space. So I've taken the same colours and this time I have cut them all down to the same width. And I'm going to add some liquid glue onto the back of the strips and then place them down onto the tag. Again, I'm going to place them down at a diagonal. I don't think it would matter quite as much with this one, like compared to the last tag, but I still quite like the look of them being at a diagonal. So I can just again try and butt those strips up as best as possible to each other, although I think it would look quite nice with gaps in between as well. But this time I'm going to have some white space at the top and then also a little bit of white space at the bottom as well. So it's not quite as colourful, but there's loads of colour in those cardstock strips. Again, I'm just going to cut off the excess with some scissors. And then I've got my two tags here with those cardstock strips on top. Next, I want to add a focal point onto the tags. So I'm taking more of that double-sided adhesive sheet and placing it down onto the back of some white panels of cardstock. This is so that I don't have to add adhesive. When I die cut the leaves and flowers that I'm going to add on top. The lines of them are really quite thin, and I didn't want to have to mess around adding adhesive onto the back of them. So this is the Flowing Foliage set from Altenew, and I'm going to die cut one of the kind of flowery type ones and then also one of just the leaves. And I'm trying my best as possible to keep that first layer into the negative. I find it easier, I should say, to have one of the layers in the negative, so that when I add layers on top, it's just going to keep them sort of in place, because like I said, those, like the stems of them especially, are really quite delicate, and I don't want them to sort of move around, distort. I want them to be in the shape that they're supposed to be. So for these pieces, I'm just trying to be as careful as possible to try and pop them out from the negative. Because they have the adhesive on the back, they do kind of stick to my fingers a little bit. Sometimes it's quite helpful though to get the inside pieces out. But in this case, I want to try and keep the inside pieces in, just so that I find it a little bit easier to stack them one on top of each other. So I can just do the same thing with this last layer. So they're going to be 3 layers high. So just line that up as best as possible, and then I can remove that from the negative portion. And now I'm going to remove all of those inside pieces. I'm then going to place that down onto vellum. And in hindsight, I would have done this in a completely different way. And I did learn my lesson by the time I got to the leaves. But on this one, it was, I guess, a bit more of an experiment on how I wanted to add the vellum underneath. So I'm using a bone folder here to really press that down. And although actually it doesn't like perfectly stick, it does take a little while for that adhesive sheet to kind of cure. So I'm trying my best now to cut around this image. I'm going to cut out most of the footage here because you don't want to see me messing around trying to figure out how to cut this all out, because by the time, like I said, I get to the leaves, I've figured out a much better way to do it. So I went around all of that flower pieces there. And for this one, I decided what would be easier is just to add pieces of vellum just behind where I actually need it and not behind the stem. And actually it works out better because then I've got that adhesive showing behind the stem piece as well. So I don't know why I didn't think of that for the first one. I think also it depends obviously on what image it is, because in this case, the leaves are like a easier shape to cut around anyway rather than those flowers, but it still would have been helpful to have done this on the first one. But that's a good thing about card making, you learn as you go. So now I can just cut around those leaf shapes. And then I'm going to adhere them down onto the tag. So I'm using some very tiny drops of liquid glue here. This glue has got a really fine tip nozzle, so it's quite good that you can just get really tiny little pieces of glue out. And I just dab that onto a scrap piece of paper as well. So that's just going to remove any excess glue so that it's not going to kind of seep out. And then using my tweezers here to place that down onto the tag. And then I'm going to pop some acrylic blocks on it while the glue dries. And then I can just do the same thing there for the leaf one. But this time I only need the liquid glue where the vellum is, because the stems are actually exposed with that double-sided adhesive. So again, I can just pop that down onto the tag. And then I'm going to cut that excess piece of stem from the bottom of the tag. So I can just cut that down with some scissors. And then I've stamped 2 sentiments from the Altenew Tiny Sentiments Hello set. I've stamped them down onto some black cardstock with clear embossing ink. And I'm adding some white embossing powder over the top and heat setting that until they're completely melted. And then I've cut those down into strips. So I'm taking some foam tape and I'm going to add that onto the back of the strips, but I only want the foam tape to be where there isn't the actual die cut image, because I want it to kind of stay flat, kind of all one layer. So for this one here, I can just add the foam tape onto the right, and then the left side is going to be overlapping where that leaf is. But for the one here, I need to add tiny little pieces of that foam tape in between those stems. So just cutting little pieces down, using my tweezers there just to kind of stick them on, and then I can pop that sentiment down. I'm then going to add some clean white tags onto the back of these ones. Although these tags haven't got ink or anything like that on the back, it's quite nice just to have that kind of beveled edge. What I love about die cutting is it kind of rounds the edges slightly, and I think it gives a finished look, and so I wanted to add those onto the back of these tags, and also it gives it a little bit of extra stability as well because it's 2 layers of cardstock thick. I'm then taking some black baker's twine and I'm popping that through the tag and tying that in a bow. I do just fiddle with the bows a little bit, try and get them as best as I can, and then I can cut the tails down, and I do like to leave the tails quite long. And I can just do the same thing for the other tag there as well. And I like that the black twine kind of brings the colours together because you've got the black cardstock of the sentiments as well. So I really like how they turned out. I think my favourite one is this one here with the white space. I do really like the colourful one as well, but I quite like having just that white space at either end of those cardstock strips. But I'd love to hear your thoughts on which one you like best if you're happy to leave me a comment. Links to the products that I used will be listed in the description bar on YouTube and also over on my blog. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you soon.